The temporal displacement field didn't care about destinations. That was the brutal engineering truth John Connor had learned from the Resistance's best physicists in the ruins of what used to be Pasadena. The device didn't navigate so much as it threw, and whoever was standing in the emission radius when the capacitors discharged went wherever the math said they were going. Usually that meant a specific coordinate set, a calculated moment in time, a surgical insertion into history's soft tissue. Usually, the capacitors had taken 3 autocannon rounds before discharge. The flash was white, then nothing, then here, wherever here was. John hit ground that wasn't Los Angeles. He knew that before he finished rolling, before the ringing in his ears subsided enough to register the sound that replaced it. Now, Los Angeles in 1994 didn't sound like this. Los Angeles in 1994 didn't shake. The earth beneath him was vibrating with something rhythmic and massive. A drum beat felt in the sternum rather than heard. And when he got his knees under him and looked up through smoke that smelled like burning metal and ozone and something else, something industrial and hot, he saw the foot come down. It was the size of a small building. The BattleMech was perhaps 60 tons of olive drab war machine, humanoid only in the loosest architectural sense, its torso bristling with weapons configurations John had no vocabulary for. It was striding through what had been a town, low prefab structures, a market square, civilian infrastructure, and it was not alone. 3 more of the machines moved behind it in a loose formation, unhurried, systematic, airing their passage, converting buildings to rubble with the casual indifference of weather. John Connor lay flat and did not move. "You are uninjured." The T-800 was already standing. It had landed better. It always landed better. Mass and chassis distributing impact in ways human bone couldn't manage. And it was doing what it always did in the first seconds of a new situation: cataloging. Its optical array swept the destruction with the patient thoroughness of a machine that had no concept of shock, and what it saw did not compute against any database it carried. "Those are not Skynet units," John said. It wasn't a question. "No. Construction, locomotion, and weapon systems are inconsistent with any Cyberdyne or Skynet manufacturing profile. Mass estimated between 40 and 80 tons per unit. Weapons include energy emitters and projectile systems of unknown specification." A pause that wasn't hesitation. The T-800 didn't hesitate, but something functionally similar. Processing time for data that genuinely surprised it. "I have no tactical record of this hardware." John had never heard those words from a T-800 before. He pulled himself behind the remnant of a wall and risked a look at the broader picture. The machines, he needed a different word for them. They weren't Terminators, they were something else entirely. Were converging on the far end of the settlement, where a cluster of larger structures were putting up a defense. Small arms fire, a few vehicle-mounted weapons, nothing that seemed to trouble the walking fortresses. People were running. Some weren't running anymore. "We need cover," John said. "Real cover. Soren, not this." "Agreed. Structure to the northeast remains load-bearing. Recommend immediate relocation." They moved. The T-800 moved the way it always did, which was efficiently and without self-consciousness, its bulk navigating rubble with a grace that looked wrong until you stopped expecting it to look human. John moved the way he'd been trained to move, which was low and fast and using everything available. They crossed 40 meters of open ground between one giant footfall and the next, slid into the shadow of a structure that was, impossibly, still standing. Its walls some kind of reinforced composite that had survived the shockwave from a near miss by whatever weapon system had just leveled the building beside it. Inside, darkness, the smell of lubricant and ozone, and people, 3 of them, adults, unarmed with weapons that were recognizable as firearms, even if the specific models weren't, wearing patchwork gear that had the functional look of military equipment that had been repaired too many times. They spun at John and the T-800's entrance with the trained speed of people who had been expecting to die in the next 10 minutes and had decided to make it expensive. The largest of them, a woman, dark-skinned, close-cropped hair, a scar along her jaw that had the deliberate straightness of a blade, kept her weapon on the T-800 and didn't waver. "What," she said very carefully, "is that?" "He's with me," John said. "That is not an answer to my question." Outside, the ground shook. One of the massive machines passed close enough that dust sifted from the ceiling in thin curtains. When and for a moment conversation became physically impossible. The acoustic pressure of that much moving metal at that proximity was a presence in the room, something that sat on the chest and reminded the body how small it was. When it passed, the woman hadn't moved her weapon. "I'm John Connor. We came through a..." He stopped. Explained the temporal displacement device to people who'd never heard of Skynet or Cyberdyne while giant robots destroyed their town outside. "Right. We came through a portal. We didn't mean to land here. We don't know where here is." "Wotan's Landing?" said one of the other two. Younger, a tech's hands, grease under the nails. "Draconis Combine Frontier." Or it was before the clans hit the jump point 3 days ago. The word meant nothing to John. "The big ones outside," Wise John said. "Yet what are they?" The woman finally lowered her weapon, not because she trusted them, but because the question told her something about how lost they genuinely were. "BattleMechs," she said. "Clan Wolf, by the insignia. And unless you have something useful to contribute in the next..." She checked a device on her wrist. "4 minutes, we are going to be very dead." The T-800's optical array moved from the woman to John with the patient precision of a machine, waiting for orders. John Connor looked at the three strangers, at the T-800, at the wall behind which something 60 tons heavy was methodically destroying a world he didn't recognize, and felt something click into place behind his sternum. Not courage exactly, more like the acceptance of a situation as real and therefore workable. "Okay," he said. "Tell me about BattleMechs." Fast. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Indeed, the woman's name was Sarah Valdis, and she had been commanding the Iron Pact for 11 years. She said this not as introduction, but as context, the way experienced soldiers delivered credentials, efficiently, without pride, because pride was a peacetime luxury, and they were currently crouched in a reinforced supply depot, while Clan Wolf BattleMechs systematically dismantled her operational area. The Iron Pact was a mercenary company, mid-sized by inner sphere standards, which meant they had 17 BattleMechs when they were at full strength. They were not at full strength. The clan raid had been running for 72 hours, and the Iron Pact was down to 9 operational units. A battered Union-class dropship that couldn't break atmosphere with its port thruster damaged, and an approximately 400 personnel who were trying very hard not to become statistics. The younger tech was Peter. The third person was a Mechwarrior named Doss, compact and quiet, with the particular stillness of someone who spent most of their professional life strapped into a cockpit and had learned to conserve motion everywhere else. None of them stopped watching the T-800. John couldn't blame them. He'd had years to get used to it, or as close to used to it as anyone got. And he still caught himself tracking it in peripheral vision the way prey tracked predators, that deep animal awareness that something in the room was built for killing and knew it. For Valdis and her people, who were seeing it for the first time, it must have been like watching physics decide to become threatening. "Your companion," Valdis said, during a lull in the external percussion. "It's not a mech, not any design I've seen, and I've seen most of them." "He's not a mech," John said. "He's..." The word robot felt inadequate. The word Terminator was a conversation he didn't have time for. "He's a combat chassis, autonomous. He follows my direction." Valdis looked at the T-800 with the evaluating squint of someone pricing salvage. "What's it armed with?" "I am armed with a GEM-134 minigun, currently non-operational due to ammunition depletion, and a Westinghouse M95A1 plasma rifle, also non-operational." The T-800 delivered this inventory with the flat neutrality it brought to everything. "Hand-to-hand combat capability remains fully functional. I am also carrying a .45 caliber pistol with 11 rounds remaining." Peter made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Carry 11 rounds against clan wolves." "It is what is available," the T-800 said. "What Peter means," Valdis said carefully, "is that the weapon systems on a single clan BattleMech can level this building in approximately 2 shots. Individual firearms are not a meaningful tactical contribution against that." "Then we need to be inside one," John said. The room went quiet in a specific way. The quiet of people who have just heard something that is simultaneously obvious and completely insane. "You want to pilot a BattleMech," Doss said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone deciding whether to be offended. I want options, John said. I want to understand what we're working with. Can we capture one of those things? Disable one? Can we get to your other units? Well, what does your tactical picture actually look like right now? Valdez studied him for a moment. John had been studied like that before, by resistance fighters deciding if he was actually the person they'd been told was coming, by people weighing whether the teenager in front of them could possibly be worth the investment the future claimed he was. He'd learned not to perform confidence. Perform confidence looked like a teenager trying to seem older. Real assessment looked like exactly what he was doing, asking questions, listening, building a picture. Our remaining 9 mechs are consolidated at Landing Pad 7, 2 kilometers northeast, Valdez said, making a decision. The clan force is a trinary, 3 stars, 15 mechs. They're not trying to hold this settlement. They're raiding for supplies in Isorla. Isorla, John repeated. Captured equipment and personnel. Bondsmen. She paused. Slaves, essentially, though the clans have a philosophical framework around it that they find very convincing. Her tone made clear what she thought of that framework. The good news is they're operating under zellbrigen protocols, ritual combat rules, one-on-one engagements, announced challenges. It slowed their consolidation. They're following rules, John said slowly, while destroying this town. Clan rules, which are real rules to them, just not the ones civilians recognize as mercy. Valdez pulled out a battered tactical display, a flat unit that projected a dim topographic overlay. The raid commander is a star colonel named Etienne Carnes, young, aggressive, looking to win glory. He's been issuing formal challenges to our Mechwarriors rather than simply overwhelming us, which is why we still have 9 mechs instead of 0. The T-800 had been still throughout this briefing in the way it was always still. Not passive, but processing, its optical array making small, precise movements that John recognized as active cataloging. Now it spoke. The ritual combat protocol creates predictable engagement patterns, it said. If challenges must be formally issued and accepted, force deployment is constrained. The Star Colonel cannot commit his full trinary simultaneously without violating his own doctrine. Valdez looked at the T-800 with an expression that recalibrated slightly. That's correct. Then the constraint is exploitable, the T-800 said. If engagements can be controlled, the tactical situation is more favorable than the raw force disparity suggests. The constraint is exploitable, Valdez agreed, if you have Mechwarriors to accept the challenges. I have 9. He has 15, and his are clan OmniMechs. Technology that outperforms our hardware in nearly every category. She folded the display. So the question I'm currently sitting with, Mr. Connor, is what exactly you two bring to that equation. Because right now you're additional mouths in a very small shelter, and I need to know if that changes. John looked at the T-800. The T-800 looked at John with its flat, patient, amber-lit gaze. Outside, the ground shook again, closer this time. Show us your mechs, John said. All of them. Whatever you have in the hangar, operational or not. Let him look at them. Why? John Connor almost smiled. Because he learns fast. The tunnel to Landing Pad 7 had been a maintenance conduit once, something utilitarian and unglamorous running beneath Wotan's Landing's industrial district, wide enough for cargo lifters and smelling permanently of hydraulic fluid and recycled air. Now it was an artery, the Iron Pack's lifeline between their shelter network and the consolidated BattleMech force that represented everything standing between the settlement's surviving civilians and complete clan absorption. They moved through it in single file, Doss on point, Valdez behind him, then John, then the T-800, then Peter, who kept maximum possible distance from the T-800 and clearly thought he was being subtle about it. The tunnel shook intermittently. Dust came down in pulses. The rhythm of it was almost regular enough to predict, which meant the clan patrol patterns were consistent, which meant John filed that away, added it to the picture he was assembling. The hangar was carved into bedrock beneath the landing pad, reinforced with the practical brutality of people who built things to survive artillery rather than impress investors. 9 BattleMechs stood in various states of readiness in the amber work lighting, attended by techs who moved around their legs with the focused urgency of surgical teams. The machines were enormous in a way that didn't fully register until you were standing among them. Not the distant enormity of seeing them move across a battlefield, but the immediate architectural enormity of being at foot level. Craning upward at knees that were themselves taller than John, ours had torsos that blocked the ceiling lighting and threw complex shadows across the hangar floor. John Connor, who had grown up in the shadow of Skynet's war machines, felt something he rarely felt. Small. The T-800 did not feel small, or if it didn't record that as a relevant variable. It walked the length of the hangar with a deliberate, unhurried pace that was entirely unlike sightseeing and entirely like something being memorized. It stopped at the first mech, a heavy machine, its torso housing a massive cylindrical weapon system that Peter identified as an autocannon, and stood for 11 seconds without moving. "What's it doing?" Doss asked quietly. "Learning," John said. "From standing there?" "From standing there." The T-800 moved to the next mech, stopped, moved on. It was working systematically from left to right. We're spending between 8 and 15 seconds at each machine, its optical array tracking from ground-level actuators up through the knee joints, hip assemblies, torso weapon mounts, cockpit housings. It paused longest at a damaged hunchback, a squat, aggressive-looking design dominated by a single massive autocannon mounted directly on its right shoulder. The weapon so large it had reshaped the entire silhouette of the mech into something asymmetric and purposeful, whose left arm actuator had been sheared away by weapons fire, leaving a stump of structural members and severed myomer bundles. "This one took significant damage," the T-800 said. "Hunchback HBK-4G, Peter said, professional habit overriding his discomfort. "Battered, but the autocannon's intact and the engine's fine. Left arm's gone, but a hunchback doesn't really need it. The AC-20 does the work. We can't get a replacement actuator until resupply, which isn't happening while the wolves are on top of us." "The cockpit interface," in the T-800 said. "Describe the control system." Peter blinked, looked at Valdis. Valdis made a small gesture that meant answer the question. "Dual joystick primary configuration, throttle on the left, weapons triggers integrated into the right grip. Targeting is handled through the primary display. You designate via HUD overlay. The targeting computer handles ballistics correction. Neurohelmet interfaces with the Mechwarrior's sense of balance. Helps keep the mech upright during movement. Without a neurohelmet, you're flying manually, which," he stopped, reconsidered, "which nobody does. The gyroscopic compensation requires the neural link or the mech falls over." "I do not have a neural link," the T-800 said. "Describe the gyroscopic compensation mechanism." Peter described it. The T-800 asked 4 follow-up questions, each more specific than the last, each landing on exactly the load-bearing assumption in Peter's previous answer. John watched the tech's expression move through impatience, surprise, and something approaching reluctant respect. He'd seen that progression before. The T-800 had a way of asking questions that revealed it was building a complete functional model rather than collecting facts, and people who worked with complex systems recognized that quality even when they didn't want to. John spent the time differently. Then he found Valdis at the tactical display she'd set up on a portable unit near the hangar's command station and stood beside her without asking permission, because asking permission to look at a tactical display was something junior people did, and he couldn't afford to be junior right now. "Walk me through their forced disposition," he said. She did, with the efficiency of someone who'd given too many briefings in too little time. The Clan Wolf Trinary was operating in 3 stars of 5 mechs each. 1 star held the settlement's northern perimeter. 1 was mobile, running supply interdiction. The 3rd, the command star, under Etienne Carnes, was positioned at the settlement's central square, issuing challenges to iron-packed mech warriors and engaging them one at a time in accordance with zellbrigen protocols. "He's fought 4 of our mech warriors since the raid began," Valdis said. 1-3. The 4th was a draw he called in his opponent's favor. "I think he's establishing a reputation for honorable conduct, making a point about clan superiority being something other than simple brutality. He's winning hearts and minds while he raids them," John said. "Crudely put, but accurate. The clans believe they are humanity's rightful rulers returning to reclaim the inner sphere. Carnes wants the people of Wotan's Landing to understand the distinction between conquest and liberation." Her voice was flat. "Not the civilians whose homes are rubble may have difficulty appreciating the nuance. How many challenges can we refuse before the protocol breaks down?" Zellbrigen allows a defender to decline twice before the attacker is honor-bound to consider it a forfeit and advance. We've used one refusal already. She looked at him sideways. You're thinking about the ritual structure as a timer. I'm thinking about the ritual structure as the only thing keeping 15 mechs from hitting 9 simultaneously, John said, which means we have to keep engaging, keep accepting challenges. By time. For what? John looked across the hangar at the T-800, which had climbed, somehow with an ease that made Peter visibly nervous, partway up the hunchback's damaged left side, and was examining the severed actuator assembly with its hands. We're turning components that weighed 30 kilograms with the careful precision of a watchmaker. For that, John said. Valdez followed his gaze. The T-800 had paused its physical examination and was now apparently doing nothing. Standing on the mech's hip housing, one hand resting on the torso plating, optical array directed at nothing visible. It's memorizing the internal schematic through the access points, John said quietly. Give it another hour and it'll have built a complete functional model of that hunchback from physical examination alone. Then it'll want to sit in the cockpit. And then? John Connor had watched a T-800 learn to ride a motorcycle in 45 seconds. He'd watched one master a field radio in 20. He'd watched one reverse engineer a weapon system from first principles in a firefight. And then, he said, according we have a 10th mech. Valdez was quiet for a moment. Outside, the bedrock shook. One of her techs called a status update across the hangar. The mobile star had changed vector, moving closer to the landing pad perimeter. Your machine, she said carefully. If it pilots a mech, will it follow the zellbrigen? The one-on-one protocols? John opened his mouth, closed it, thought about the T-800's primary function, its combat optimization, its complete absence of anything resembling a concept of honorable restraint in battle. It'll follow my direction, he said finally, which was not, Valdez's expression made clear, the same thing as yes. The challenge came at 0340, broadcast on open frequencies in the clipped, formal cadence that John was learning to recognize as Clan Wolf communication style. Precise, hierarchical, carrying the particular weight of words that were also weapons. Star Colonel Etienne Carnes, commanding the raid trinary, was issuing a formal trial of possession for the Iron Pack's dropship and its technical personnel. He named the terms with the methodical clarity of someone reciting liturgy. Single combat, Mechwarrior against Mechwarrior, zellbrigen protocols observed, the outcome binding on both parties. He gave the Iron Pact 1 hour to field a champion. Valdez listened to the broadcast in the command area of the hangar, her expression doing the careful work of not showing what she was calculating. And John watched her do it and recognized the math. The same math every commander did when the options were bad and the clock was running. She had 9 mechs and 9 pilots, but 3 of those pilots were running damaged machines that were operational only in the generous sense of the word, and none of her hardware matched what the clan star colonel would put in the field. A trial of possession sounded like a better option than open engagement. It was also almost certainly a loss. He'll send an OmniMech, Doss said. He was already in his cooling vest, the garment mech warriors wore beneath their cockpit gear, a network of tubes that managed the catastrophic heat a running fusion reactor generated in an enclosed space. Probably a Timberwolf, best mech in his inventory for single combat. Can you beat a Timberwolf? John asked. So Doss was quiet for a moment. In my Griffin, against a clan pilot in a Timberwolf? He said it the way honest soldiers said difficult things, directly without drama. No. Then don't fight it straight, John said. Zellbrigen doesn't allow... I'm not talking about cheating his rules. I'm talking about making him fight your fight instead of his. John pulled the tactical display, orienting to the terrain map of the settlement and its surroundings. What's the ground like between here and his position? What followed was 2 hours of planning that John drove and Valdez refined and Doss executed with the precise professional skepticism of a mech warrior being asked to trust a teenager's rid of terrain he'd never walked. The Iron Pack's acceptance of the trial went out on the same open frequency. She properly formatted. Valdez had drilled her comms officer on clan protocol in the first hours of the raid, because knowing the enemy's language was basic survival, and the designated combat zone was a flat expanse of ground north of the settlement where a grain processing facility had been reduced to foundation slabs and scattered debris. John spent those 2 hours doing something else as well. He spent them watching the T-800 work. By 0200, the T-800 had moved through every mech in the hangar with the systematic thoroughness of a machine that didn't need sleep or breaks or moments to absorb what it was learning. It had repaired the Hunchback's sensor relay in 9 minutes, which had caused the lead tech. Her name was Okafor, and she had 20 years of experience and the healthy ego that came with it, to follow it to the next machine with the expression of someone revising their assumptions in real time. By 0300, it had identified fault conditions in 3 other units that the Iron Pack's maintenance cycle hadn't caught, had explained the engineering basis for each fault in terms precise enough that Okafor could brief her team, and had developed what appeared to be a functional working relationship with Peter based entirely on a shared language of mechanical systems. At 0320, John found it standing in front of the Hunchback, repaired now, the left leg moving cleanly through its full range of motion in a diagnostic cycle, with its head tilted at the angle it adopted when processing something outside its existing models. "You want to get in it," John said. "In what I want to understand the interface," the T-800 said. "The tactical utility of these units is significant. If we are to operate in this environment for any extended period, understanding their operation is tactically necessary. Can you fit in the cockpit?" The cockpit dimensions on this unit are designed for a human pilot in standard cooling gear. My chassis dimensions are within tolerance. The neurohelmet interface will not function. It requires biological neural input for gyroscopic balance calibration. I will need to manage balance through direct sensor feedback instead. John looked at it. "You've already worked out how to compensate for not being able to use the neurohelmet." "Yes." "When did you work that out?" "Approximately 40 minutes after entering the hangar." John rubbed his face with both hands. Outside, half the countdown to the trial was running. Inside, a Terminator had independently determined how to pilot a BattleMech and was waiting with mechanical patience for someone to tell it to get in one. He thought about arguing. He thought about the tactical situation. 15 clan mechs, 9 iron-packed units, a trial that Doss was probably going to lose, and the raid continuing regardless. And he thought about the thing he'd told Valdis when she'd asked what they brought to the equation. He learns fast. "Not this fight," John said. "Doss fights this one. We watch, we learn the terrain, we understand how these trials actually work before we change the variables. Agreed?" The T-800 considered this with the processing pause that meant it was evaluating, not complying automatically. "Agreed," it said. "Observation has tactical value." They watched the trial from the hangar's external cameras. Doss was good. John could see that in the Griffin's movement. Economical, precise, using the debris field on the combat ground the way John had suggested, forcing the engagement angles. The Timberwolf that Karn sent was exactly what Doss had predicted. Fast, brutally armed, its pilot moving with the fluid aggression of someone who had trained inside a cockpit since childhood. It lasted 11 minutes. The Griffin went down hard, one leg sheared away by an extended-range large laser that the terrain hadn't been enough to prevent. Doss ejecting cleanly into the gray morning sky. The Timberwolf stood over the fallen mech with the stillness of a completed statement. The Iron Pact had just lost a BattleMech and gained a very clear picture of the gap between them and the clan force arrayed against them. John watched the Timberwolf's cockpit canopy and thought about 11 minutes, about what Doss had done right and what the terrain had and hadn't provided, about the way the clan pilot had moved. Aggressive, brilliant, and absolutely certain that their hardware and training were simply better. Certainty John Connor's entire life had taught him was a vulnerability. He turned to the T-800. "Tomorrow," he said, "we find you a cockpit." Okafor spent 4 hours arguing that it couldn't be done and then spent the next 3 doing it anyway. When the neurohelmet problem was the central obstacle, the interface that allowed a Mechwarrior's own sense of balance to feed directly into a BattleMech's gyroscopic stabilization system. The biological component that made the difference between a controlled war machine and 80 tons of falling metal. Without it, a pilot was fighting the mech's balance systems manually, compensating through instruments alone, which was possible in theory the way that many things were possible in theory and catastrophic in practice. Okafor had explained this to the T-800 at length, with diagrams, with the particular patience of an expert who has decided to treat an unusual student as a legitimate student rather than an obstacle. The T-800 had listened, asked 6 questions that made Okafor pause each time, and then explained what it intended to do instead. Its internal gyroscopic array, the system that let a 200-pound endoskeleton move with human fluidity across any terrain, could be recalibrated to interface with the hunchback's balance feedback loop through the existing neurohelmet port, bypassing the biological neural requirement by substituting direct electronic input. It would need a physical interface connection, a hard line rather than the standard neural induction, which meant a cable running from the neurohelmet port to a modified access point at the base of the T-800 skull, where Okafor's team would need to install a connector they had never built before. Okafor had said it couldn't be done. So then she looked at the T-800's internal schematics, which it had provided from its own diagnostic system with the cooperative matter-of-factness it brought to all technical problems. And she'd gone quiet for a long time, and then she called Peter over, and they'd had a conversation in low urgent tones while the T-800 waited. And then Okafor had said they'd need 4 hours minimum and the right components, and if this went wrong, it went wrong inside an 80-ton machine with a running fusion reactor, and she wanted that noted for the record. John had said noted. Get it done. The hunchback's cockpit was tight even for a standard pilot. The T-800 occupied it the way it occupied most spaces designed for humans, with a precise awareness of clearances and a complete absence of claustrophobia. On us settling into the command couch with the methodical care of something that understood exactly how much space it needed. The hardline cable ran from the neurohelmet port to the connector at the base of its skull, 3 meters of heavily shielded wire that Peter had assembled from components that weren't designed for this purpose and had been persuaded into it through the kind of creative engineering that happened when a brilliant technician was sufficiently motivated. The first power-up sequence ran at 0600. John watched from the hangar floor as the hunchback came to life around the T-800. Reactor cycling up through its startup sequence, systems initializing in cascading order. The massive autocannon on the right shoulder rotating through its arc check with a sound like industrial machinery deciding to become geological. And the mech's posture shifted as gyroscopic control engaged, a subtle thing, the way a standing figure settles its weight. Then it took a step. The first step was wrong. Too deliberate. The balance compensation a half second behind the motion, the hunchback's torso dipping and correcting in a way that made Okafor wince visibly. The second step was better. The third step was the same as the first two, except the T-800 had already processed the error pattern and adjusted. And by the fifth step, it was walking with something that wasn't quite the fluid competence of an experienced Mechwarrior, but was unmistakably controlled. A machine learning to wear another machine. By the end of the first hour, it was running. Valdez had watched the test from the hangar entrance with the expression she used for information that required complete reassessment of a situation. When the hunchback returned from its circuit of the landing pad and powered down to standby, she found John near the cooling systems and stood beside him without speaking for a moment. "How?" she said finally. "It learns fast," John said. "I told you. You told me. I didn't understand what you meant." She watched Okafor's team running post-exercise diagnostics on the hunchback's leg systems. "It's been here for less than 36 hours. It just piloted a BattleMech. Badly at first. Less badly with every step." She turned to look at him directly. "What is it, Connor? Actually, because combat chassis is a description, it's not an answer." John considered the distance between the truth and what was useful. "He was built by a machine intelligence that wanted humanity destroyed," he said. "Built to hunt and kill specific human targets. We reprogrammed him, changed the mission parameters." He paused. "He's been protecting me for a while now." Valdez absorbed this with the stillness of someone who had encountered enough strange things in mercenary work that the category of impossible had become currently unexplained. And the machine intelligence that built him doesn't exist yet where we come from. Might not exist at all, if things go right. He looked at the hunchback. "That's what we were trying to prevent when the device malfunctioned." "So you're from the past," Valdez said. "Fighting a war against the future?" "Something like that." She was quiet again. Outside, a distant explosion marked another clan probe against the settlement's perimeter. Star Colonel Carnes consolidating his hold, inventorying his Asorla, preparing the next formal challenge. The Iron Pact had declined 2 challenges since Doss's loss, citing equipment damage, buying time under clan protocol that allowed brief delays for legitimate technical reasons. That window was closing. The clan pilot, John said, in the trial yesterday, he was better than DOS. Clan warriors trained from childhood, Valdez said. Sibco program, competitive selection, constant evaluation, the weakest cut at every stage. The ones who make it to a trinary command are the survivors of a process designed to produce the best possible warriors. Karn's pilots have been doing this since they could walk. John nodded slowly. Ever so they're optimized. Completely. And they've never fought anything that was optimized the same way they were. He looked at Valdez. Not something that learned their patterns in real time and adjusted. Not something that didn't feel pain or fatigue or doubt. He let that sit for a moment. Karns has been issuing trials because his doctrine requires it and because he's confident he wins everyone. He's right against your pilots. He's been fighting humans. Valdez understood where this was going. The understanding moved across her face in a specific sequence. Recognition, then calculation, then the particular tension of a commander weighing a plan that was audacious enough to be either brilliant or fatal. If your chassis accepts the next challenge, she said carefully, and wins, clan honor protocol binds Karns to the outcome. He loses what he bid in the trial. And if it loses, then we're in the same position we're already in, but faster. She looked at the hunchback. And your machine spent 36 hours learning to walk in that thing. 36 hours, John said, is a long time for him. The clan scientist's name was Avantha, and she had not come to the settlement to fight. She had come, as scientists cast always came to raids, to catalog. Equipment, personnel, genetic profiles of potential bondsmen, technical specifications of captured hardware. She moved through the occupied section of Wotan's landing with a datapad and an escort of 2 elementals who were bored in the specific way that elite infantry became bored when their function was protective rather than offensive. Their massive battle armor making the prefab corridor feel architectural rather than just narrow. John hadn't planned to meet her. He'd been running a route between the hangar and an observation point Peter had identified on the settlement's northern edge, moving through back passages that the clan force hadn't bothered to fully secure, because securing every civilian utility corridor in an occupied settlement wasn't worth the personnel cost of a 3-day raid. He'd rounded a corner and nearly walked into an elemental's armored leg, which was approximately the same experience as walking into a load-bearing wall that had opinions about the intrusion. The elemental had him by the collar before he'd processed the contact. The second elemental covered the corridor behind him with a weapon that made his sidearm feel conceptually embarrassing. Avantha had looked up from her datapad with the mild interest of someone who has found something unexpected, but not particularly threatening. She was younger than John had expected, mid-30s, the clan aesthetic of precise posture and complete economy of motion. Her scientist cast insignia worn with the particular pride of someone who considered their cast's work more important than the warrior casts, and was professionally required not to say so. A free birth, she said, which John would learn later was not an insult exactly, but carried the weight of a significant categorical distinction. Unaffiliated with the mercenary unit, interesting. I'm not from around here, John said. The elemental's grip was not painful yet, but carried a clear advisory about available pressure. No, Avantha agreed, consulting her datapad. Hey, your clothing is not any inner sphere manufacturer I can identify. Your equipment is similarly anomalous. She studied him with the focused attention of someone for whom everything was data. You arrived with the combat chassis. John went still. We have sensor logs, Avantha said, not unkindly. The energy signature that accompanied your arrival was not consistent with any known transportation technology, not hyperspace emergence, not dropship insertion, not standard Stargate. She paused at his expression. Forgive me, an inner sphere reference. The point is that whatever brought you here was not any technology currently in operation in the inner sphere or the clan homeworlds. She tilted her head with the precise curiosity of a scientist who has found a genuinely novel specimen, which makes you and your companion extremely interesting to my cast. They put him in a room that was clean and not a cell exactly, though the distinction was primarily architectural. The elementals remained outside. Avantha sat across a salvage table with her datapad and the manner of someone who had a great many questions and had learned through professional necessity to ask them in the right order. What followed was 2 hours that John hadn't expected to find educational. Evantha wanted to know about the T-800's construction, materials, power source, cognitive architecture. John gave her enough to be plausible without being useful, the resistance fighter's habit of compartmentalizing information, and she accepted his limits with the grace of a scientist who understood that data had to be earned. In exchange, and with the apparent belief that information shared was information that built toward more information, she talked about the clans. John had needed to understand them since the moment the first BattleMech foot came down on Wotan's Landing's market square. What Evantha provided over 2 hours was something more complex and more disturbing than the enemy profile he'd been constructing. The clans were the Star League Defense Force's children, not metaphorically, literally, the remnant of the greatest military force humanity had ever assembled, who had followed General Alexander Kerensky into self-imposed exile 300 years ago, rather than serve the corrupt successor states that destroyed the Star League. When they had built a society in the periphery around the principle that they were preserving humanity's best until the time came to return and restore what had been lost. Their entire culture, the Sibco training programs, the trial systems, the caste structure, the warrior ethos, had been constructed around the mission of producing the finest possible human beings to carry that restoration forward. They were, Evantha explained with the careful neutrality of a scientist caste member discussing warrior caste ideology, absolutely convinced that what they were doing to the inner sphere was salvation. John listened to this and felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. A system that decided, scientifically and systematically, which humans were worth preserving and which were not. A society that took children and ran them through competitive selection processes designed to identify and cultivate the optimal specimens while discarding the rest. A culture that had built its entire identity around the belief that it was humanity's best hope, and that this belief justified everything. The raids, the bondsmen, the occupation of worlds whose populations had no say in their own salvation. He knew this architecture. He'd seen it before, in a different register. The cold logic of a system that decided human value computationally, that optimized for specific outcomes without reference to the humans caught in the optimization. Your warrior caste, John said carefully. The ones who don't make it through selection, what happens to them? They serve in other capacities, Evantha said. Salama units, second-line garrison forces. They contribute according to their demonstrated capability. And the ones below that threshold? A pause. The clan exists to produce the best possible warriors for the restoration. Resources are allocated accordingly. John nodded slowly. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that he had crossed time and arrived in a universe where humanity had independently invented a version of Skynet's logic and called it culture, had built the selection algorithm into their social structure and called it honor, had decided that optimizing human beings was the same as saving them. He understood the clans now. He understood them in a way that made him want to win this fight considerably more than survival alone required. When Valdez's people found him 2 hours later, a 3-person extraction team who'd tracked his last known position and moved through the unsecured corridors with professional quiet, Evantha let him go with the equanimity of a scientist releasing a specimen back into the field, noting something on her datapad as he left. John didn't ask what she'd written. He was fairly sure he knew. Remarkable. More data required. John came back from the scientist's room with 2 things: a clearer picture of what the clans were, and a decision that had been forming since the moment Evantha described the Sibco selection process with the calm professional distance of someone explaining rainfall. He found Valdez in the command area and laid it out without preamble. The clan raid on Wotan's Landing was not the primary operation. Evantha hadn't said this directly. She was too careful for direct disclosure. The scientist caste's relationship with the warrior caste too politically textured for casual intelligence sharing with a free birth prisoner. But she'd talked about the raid's cataloging objectives with a specificity that didn't match a standard Isorla operation, and she'd mentioned 3 times in 3 different contexts. In the agricultural processing capacity of the Wotan system's secondary settlements. Not this settlement, the ones 40 kilometers east and 60 kilometers south, the ones that John had seen on Valdez's tactical display as small population markers in terrain he hadn't prioritized. Carnes wasn't here for the Iron Pack's dropship. He was here to assess supply infrastructure for a larger force movement. The trials, the formal challenges, the zellbrigen protocols, they were real. The clan honor system was genuine, but they were also conveniently consuming the Iron Pack's attention and resources while Clan Wolf scientists and merchant castes ran logistics assessments on 3 worlds' worth of food production capacity. The Asorla was incidental. The data was the objective. If that assessment completes, John said, wherein it goes back to Clan Wolf's Khan with a recommendation that this system can support a full cluster occupation, you don't get a raid, you get a conquest. 3 worlds, 40,000 civilians, and no mercenary company left to contest it because Karns will have run the Iron Pack to nothing through trials before his Khan arrives. Valdis sat with this for a long moment. You got this from the scientist. From what the scientist didn't say carefully enough. She looked at him with the expression she'd been using more frequently since the T-800's test run. The one that meant she was revising her model of who she was dealing with. You're certain. I'm certain enough to act on it, John said, which is the only kind of certain that matters. The planning session that followed ran 4 hours and involved every senior Iron Pact officer plus the T-800, which participated not by offering opinions, but by producing, when asked, precise calculations of engagement angles, weapon range envelopes, and terrain analysis that Valdis's tactical officer accepted with the slightly dazed expression of someone whose job was being done better than they could do it in real time. John ran the strategic logic while the T-800 ran the numbers, and Valdis translated both into executable orders for people who had been fighting this kind of war for their entire careers. The plan had 3 components. The first was a feint, 2 of the Iron Pack's lighter mechs, the Jenners, every running a harassment pattern against Karn's eastern perimeter that would look like a probing attack and demand response. It wouldn't damage anything significant. It would consume warrior caste attention, which was the resource John wanted to drain. The second was a ground operation. Peter had identified the route Evantha's cataloging team was using to reach the secondary settlements. A supply road that ran through a valley system south of the main settlement, accessible by vehicle, not worth securing with BattleMechs because BattleMechs didn't fit on it comfortably. John would take a 6-person team, interrupt the cataloging operation before it completed, and remove the data Evantha had collected. Not capture, not kill. Remove the data. Deny Clan Wolf's Khan the logistical assessment that would make a full cluster deployment viable. When the third component was the T-800, Star Colonel Karns would issue another trial challenge in the morning. The Iron Pact had been buying time with equipment damage claims, but the clan honor system's patience for delays had a limit, and that limit was approaching. When the challenge came, the hunchback would accept it. He's had 48 hours in that cockpit, John told Valdis, running drills, learning the weapon systems, practicing the balance compensation. Okafor says the hardline interface is holding clean. 48 hours, Valdis said, against a clan pilot who has trained since childhood. The clan pilot has trained to fight other humans, John said. Pilots who get tired. Pilots who feel the heat build up in the cockpit and start making small errors after the 3rd hour. It are pilots who have an instinctive aversion to taking damage because damage means pain. He let that land. The T-800 doesn't run heat protocols. It doesn't fatigue. It processes damage as tactical data rather than physical experience. And it has been watching every trial engagement on sensor record, cataloging every pattern in Karn's pilot's movement and decision-making. And if it loses, then we're where we are. But it won't lose the way DOS lost. It won't be outclassed by biology. Whatever happens in that cockpit happens because of tactics and hardware, and those are problems we can work with. Valdis was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that was actually intense calculation wearing a calm exterior. The ground operation, she said finally. Konos, you're leading it yourself. Yes, you're a teenager. I'm a teenager who just mapped a clan logistics operation from a 2-hour conversation with a scientist cast member, John said. And I've been running operations against superior forces since I was old enough to carry a weapon. With respect, Commander, I'm not asking permission for the ground element. I'm informing you of what I'm going to do. Something shifted in Valdis's expression. Not offense, which is what John had half expected, but something closer to recognition. The recalibration that happened when you stopped seeing what someone looked like and started seeing what they actually were. Take Peter, she said. He knows the terrain south of the settlement better than anyone. And take 2 of my infantry squad. She paused. And Connor. Yeah. Don't get killed. I am genuinely beginning to find you useful. John almost smiled. He was fairly certain, the closest thing to a compliment the Iron Pack's commander issued during active operations, and he decided to take it as the significant thing it probably was. Across the hangar, the T-800 was in the Hunchback's cockpit, running its nightly drill sequence, the great autocannon tracking through its arc with mechanical patience, learning the weapon's behavior at the granular level of a machine that had no ceiling on how precisely it could model a system if given sufficient time and data. 48 hours, John thought, against warriors who had trained since childhood. He'd seen worse odds. He'd seen much worse odds, in basements and ruins and the smoking remnants of cities that used to be places people lived. Fighting a war against a machine intelligence that had calculated humanity's extinction as the optimal solution. The math had been wrong then, too. The valley road south of Wotan's Landing was exactly what Peter had described. Narrow, unpaved, running between low hills that the area's geology had arranged into natural corridor, the kind of terrain that moved agricultural equipment efficiently, and BattleMechs not at all. John moved his 6-person team along it in the pre-dawn dark with the particular quality of attention that came from years of operating in environments where the wrong sound at the wrong moment had permanent consequences. Peter was good in the field. John hadn't expected that. The young tech had the build and manner of someone who lived indoors with machinery, but he moved quietly and read ground well, in which suggested a history that his current assignment didn't reflect. John filed that away and didn't ask, because operational context wasn't the moment for biography, and they had approximately 4 hours before dawn made their approach significantly more complicated. The 2 infantry soldiers Valdez had assigned were named Cress and Farouk. They were professional in the uncomplicated way that ground soldiers and functional mercenary units tended to be. Equipment maintained, communication minimal, spacing correct, eyes doing the right work. John had assessed them in the first 10 minutes of movement and decided he could work with them, which was the only assessment that mattered before a ground operation. The clan cataloging team was 3 vehicles, 2-wheeled transport carriers and a mobile command unit, parked at a crossroads where the valley road intersected with a track leading to the nearest secondary settlement. Eventha was not there, which John had half expected. The actual logistics work was being done by 2 merchant caste personnel with data pads and surveying equipment, escorted by 4 clan infantry in standard battle armor that was considerably less imposing than elemental gear, but considerably more imposing than anything John's team was carrying. John studied the position from a ridgeline for 11 minutes. 4 armored infantry was a problem, not an insurmountable problem. The Iron Pack soldiers had decent kit. Peter had a weapon he clearly knew how to use despite his technical specialty, and John had his sidearm and the accumulated tactical education of someone who had been fighting superior forces his entire life. But 4 armored clan infantry with alert postures in open ground around 3 vehicles was a problem that required the right solution rather than the direct one. John found the right solution in the mobile command unit's power signature. The unit was running a broad-spectrum sensor array. The cataloging operations data collection required it, pulling agricultural yield information, population data, infrastructure assessments from the settlement systems it was querying. The array needed line-of-sight elevation, which meant the command unit's sensor mast was extended to full height, which meant it was also broadcasting its position in a way that careful approach from the array's blind spot, directly behind the elevation mast, inside the sensor cone's dead zone, reduced the detection window significantly. He explained this to Cress and Farouk in 12 words. They adjusted their approach without comment. The next 40 minutes were the kind of work that John had learned to do in ruins, in basements, in the smoking remnants of machine-controlled territory, where every margin mattered, and improvisation was the only playbook available. Cress and Farouk drew the clan infantry's attention to the north with a controlled noise contact. Nothing aggressive, just enough to orient 4 sets of professional eyes away from the command unit's south side. John and Peter went through the command unit's rear access in the 90 seconds of reorientation that created, John's sidearm on the merchant caste operator inside, while Peter pulled the cataloging system's data core with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been taking machines apart since adolescence. The whole data core, not a copy, not selective deletion. The physical storage unit pulled from its housing, leaving the cataloging system running on empty like a clock with no hands. They were back on the ridgeline before the clan infantry completed their sweep of the northern contact point. The return movement was faster, the team running the valley road with the compressed urgency of a mission that had gone correctly and needed to stay that way. John's mind was already forward. Back to the hangar, back to the trial, back to the larger shape of the operation and whether the pieces were going to arrive in the right order. His earpiece crackled with Valdis's voice at 0423. Challenge issued. Star Colonel Carnes has formally challenged the Iron Pack to trial of possession. He's bidding a full star. 5 OmniMechs. 5 against 1? John said, not breaking stride. He's bidding his force down. Clan protocol. You bid the minimum force you believe will win. He's bidding 5 because he wants to make a point about the quality differential. A pause. He specifically requested to face our heaviest unit. The Hunchback was the Iron Pack's heaviest operational mech at the moment. John didn't think that was coincidental. Carnes had sensor data on the test runs. He'd seen the Hunchback moving through its drills. When he was issuing a challenge he believed was theatrical. Demonstrate clan's superiority against the mercenary company's best remaining asset, complete the raid's psychological dimension, break the Iron Pack's will to resist before the full cluster arrived. Response? Valdis asked. John checked his watch. 40 minutes to get back to the hangar. He needed the T-800 briefed and in the cockpit before the challenge window closed. Accept it, John said. Standard zellbrigen terms, 1-on-1. He bid 5 units. Tell him we'll face his bid with 1. John could hear the expression Valdis wasn't making. Clan honor protocol. He bid 5. We can counterbid 1 if we choose. It's legal under their rules. He'll accept because refusing a counterbid from inferior forces would be dishonorable. A longer pause. Sorry, that's going to make him angry. Good, John said. Angry pilots make tactical errors. Let's give him something to be angry about. In the Hunchback's cockpit, 62 kilometers per hour of dawn light falling across its scarred armor. The T-800 was running its final calibration sequence with the patient exactness of a machine that had spent 48 hours learning something and was ready to demonstrate what learning looked like when biology wasn't the limiting factor. Carnes wanted to make a point about quality. John Connor was about to let him try. The designated combat ground was the same flat expanse north of the settlement where Doss had lost his Griffin 4 days ago. The foundation slabs and debris field unchanged. All the gray morning light falling across it with the indifferent neutrality of weather that didn't care what happened underneath it. The Iron Pack's remaining Mechwarriors had brought their units to the perimeter, not as participants but as witnesses, which clan protocol required, and which meant 8 BattleMechs standing in a loose arc at the combat zone's edge with their weapons powered down, their pilots watching through cockpit glass. Star Colonel Etienne Carnes came in a Timberwolf. John had expected that. The Timberwolf was the premier clan OmniMech of the era, fast, brutally armed, its configuration flexible enough to be reconfigured between engagements for specific tactical purposes. Carnes's variant was running extended-range large lasers in the primary torso mounts with short-range missile clusters in the arms, Wayne a configuration optimized for the kind of decisive medium-range engagement that a confident pilot expected when facing a heavier, slower opponent. It moved into the combat zone with the particular grace of a machine whose pilot had been inside it long enough that the distinction between operator and operated had become academic. The Hunchback followed it in from the Iron Pack's side. John watched from the command vehicle, an armored carrier parked at the perimeter's edge, its sensor suite running full passive collection, feeding him everything the Iron Pack's systems could pull from the engagement. Valdis was beside him. Peter was at the sensor console. Nobody was talking, which was the right call because there was nothing useful left to say. Where the trial began with the formal exchange of challenges, both pilots broadcasting their names and intentions on the open frequency in the clipped clan cadence that John had learned to parse over 4 days of listening. Carnes's voice carried the controlled confidence of someone who had done this many times and expected the outcome to follow established patterns. The T-800's response was John's words, transmitted in the T-800's flat mechanical delivery. Bargained well and done, Star Colonel. Carnes's first move was textbook. Closing range while keeping the Timberwolf's profile narrow, angling to bring the extended range lasers into their optimal engagement envelope before the Hunchback's autocannon could answer effectively. The autocannon was the Hunchback's primary weapon. They were devastating at close range but slower to cycle than energy weapons, and a clan pilot's standard approach against it was to stay at the range band where the lasers outperformed it and never let the engagement compress to knife fight distance. The T-800 didn't close. It moved laterally instead, tracking across the debris field with the Hunchback's 60 tons held in careful balance. The hardline interface translating the T-800's internal gyroscopic data into the mech's stability systems with the clean precision that Okafor's 4 hours of impossible engineering had produced. The lateral movement was deliberate. Not evasion exactly, but repositioning, forcing Carnes to choose between adjusting his approach angle or accepting an engagement geometry that wasn't optimal. Carnes adjusted. He was good. His adjustment was smooth and professionally executed and was exactly what the T-800's pattern analysis, running on 48 hours of sensor data from every trial engagement the Iron Pack systems had recorded, had predicted he would do. The Hunchback stopped moving. Carnes's first laser burst hit it in the right torso, armor ablating in a spray of superheated material that Peter's console registered as significant but not critical. The second burst tracked slightly left as Carnes compensated for the unexpected stillness of his target. A pilot who stopped moving was either damaged or making a mistake, and either possibility required adjustment. The adjustment took 1.3 seconds. The T-800 had calculated that it would take between 1.1 and 1.6 seconds. The Hunchback's autocannon fired once. The AC-20 was the largest autocannon in common inner-sphere use. A weapon so massive it defined the mech built around it, its ammunition consumption so significant that engagements were measured in shots rather than duration. At optimal range, it was capable of removing a limb from a BattleMech in a single burst, the kinetic energy of its projectile stream translating into structural damage that energy weapons achieved only through sustained application. The burst caught the Timberwolf in the left torso at the moment Carnes' adjustment had his mech's profile fully presented. The damage was catastrophic and precise. The Timberwolf staggered, 65 tons of OmniMech absorbing an impact that its internal structure was designed to survive, but that its pilot's nervous system was not designed to process without response. Once the gyroscopic feedback through the neurohelmet translating kinetic impact into the visceral sensation of being hit, the involuntary biological cascade of a human body reacting to sudden violent force. Carnes recovered. He was good enough to recover. His return fire was immediate and accurate and hit the Hunchback in the center torso with enough concentrated energy to push the internal temperature toward the threshold that would begin degrading systems. The T-800 registered the temperature increase as a number. It did not sweat. It did not flinch. It did not experience the involuntary attention narrowing that human pilots called tunnel vision when heat and stress compressed decision-making into a smaller and smaller aperture. It fired again. The second burst hit the Timberwolf's damaged left torso in precisely the same location as the first. In the command vehicle, John watched the Timberwolf's structural integrity schematic collapse on the left side and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. Something more complicated. The feeling of watching a plan work that had cost enough to make the working feel earned rather than easy. Carnes ejected at the threshold moment between the mech falling and the mech exploding, the ejection seat clearing the cockpit on its emergency charge and carrying him in a ballistic arc over the debris field, while the Timberwolf completed its fall in a cascade of secondary explosions that sent a column of black smoke into the gray morning sky. The open frequency was silent for 4 seconds. Then Carnes' voice, and from the ejection seat's emergency communicator, somewhere in the debris field, "The mercenary unit fields a machine, not a Mechwarrior." His voice had the particular register of a man who had been surprised and was deciding what that meant. "This is Desgra, dishonorable. The trial is void." John keyed his own communicator. "Star Colonel." He'd been thinking about this moment since he'd understood the clan honor system well enough to see its pressure points. "Your challenge specified the Iron Pack's heaviest unit. You did not specify a human pilot. Clan Zellbrigen protocol defines the combatant by the machine, not the operator. Check your own Chatterweb records." A longer silence. "He's right." A different voice on the frequency. Older, a different accent. John didn't know who it was. He'd find out later it was Carnes' superior. He'd observing the trial on standard command channels. The bid was for units, Star Colonel. The challenge is valid. The outcome stands. What happened next was not what John had planned for, which was how he knew it was going to define everything that came after. Carnes didn't accept the outcome. He walked out of the debris field on foot, his cooling vest still steaming from the cockpit heat, his neuro helmet under one arm, and he stopped in the center of the combat ground and broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. I call trial of grievance against the operator of the mercenary machine. Personal combat, now. John Connor had planned for the T-800 to win the trial. He had not planned for Star Colonel Etienne Carnes, humiliated by a machine, to demand personal satisfaction from whoever had put it in the cockpit. He had not planned for that challenge to land, under clan protocol, on him, because he was the one who had accepted it, his voice on the response transmission, his name on the Iron Pack's formal paperwork for the engagement. Valdez looked at him. You don't have to accept. If I don't accept, the trial outcome gets complicated, John said. He'll find a procedural argument. He'll tie this up until his con arrives and we lose the time we bought. You're a teenager with a sidearm against a clan warrior. John looked at the T-800's feed on the sensor console. The hunchback standing still in the combat zone, its reactor humming, its pilot waiting with infinite mechanical patience for whatever came next. I'm not fighting him alone, John said. He picked up the communicator. Star Colonel Carnes, he said. I accept your trial of grievance. My champion is already in the field. Clan honor protocol allowed a champion. John had found this in the chatterweb records Peter had pulled during the planning phase. A procedural footnote in the trial system's extensive codification, applicable when the challenge party was a non-warrior caste member facing a warrior caste grievance. The challenge could field a champion in their place, the champion bound by the same zellbrigen protocols as any trial combatant, the outcome carrying the same binding weight as direct personal combat. The footnote had been written for merchant caste representatives and scientist caste members who found themselves on the wrong end of a warrior's anger. It had never, as far as John could determine from the records available to him, been invoked to field a machine. The clan command channel went very quiet when the T-800 stepped the hunchback forward, and John's voice came over the open frequency explaining the procedural basis for the champion designation. The quiet had texture, the specific quality of a system encountering something it hadn't been designed to process. Warriors trained to respond to every contingency finding themselves outside the contingency map. Carnes stood in the center of the combat ground and looked at the hunchback and said nothing for 17 seconds. A machine cannot hold honor, he said finally. A machine cannot be bound by trial outcome. This is Desgra by definition. A machine can be directed by someone who holds honor, John said. I hold the trial's outcome. My champion executes my direction. The honor is mine. The combat is his. But your own protocol doesn't distinguish. The older voice again, the superior on the command channel. He has found the seam, Star Colonel. A pause that carried the weight of institutional acknowledgement. It is irregular. It is not explicitly prohibited. What followed was 4 minutes of clan legal argument conducted on an open frequency, which John found simultaneously fascinating and excruciating. A warrior culture's honor system interrogating its own foundations in real time. The scientist caste's representative who had joined the channel citing chapter and provision, while the warrior caste wrestled with the implications of a procedural gap that had existed unnoticed for 300 years. In the end, Carnes accepted. Not because he was convinced, but because the alternative was backing down from his own challenge, one which the honor system made categorically worse than accepting terms he found objectionable. He accepted, and he walked to the weapons cache his elemental escort had brought from his position, and he armed himself with the weapons a dismounted clan warrior carried, a laser pistol and a vibroblade that hummed with the particular menace of a weapon designed to cut through battle armor, and he walked to the center of the combat ground and waited with the stillness of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of moment his entire life. The T-800 powered the hunchback down to standby, disconnected the hardline interface with the careful deliberateness of a machine that understood what it was doing and why, and climbed down from the cockpit. John watched it cross the combat ground on foot and felt the specific tension of a plan reaching its terminal point. The moment where preparation ended and outcome began, where the variables you'd controlled met the ones you hadn't. Carnes was 34 years old and had been training since he was 6. He was in peak physical condition by any standard, enhanced by the clan's rigorous selection and development process, carrying weapons he knew how to use with the fluency of a decade of continuous practice. He looked at the T-800 approaching across the debris field and set his stance with the professional composure of a man who had faced dangerous opponents before and understood how to manage the internal state that danger produced. He was also, John noted, angry, genuinely angry. Only underneath the composure, the particular anger of someone whose identity had been challenged at its foundation, whose sense of self as a warrior was built on the premise that he was among the best human beings his culture could produce, and who was now being asked to prove it against something that wasn't human at all. Anger, John Connor's entire life had taught him, was a vulnerability. The T-800 didn't use weapons. It didn't need to. It walked into Karn's laser fire and took the hits as thermal damage to its living tissue exterior, the hyperalloy chassis beneath absorbing the energy without structural consequence, and it covered the distance between them in the time it took Karn's to process that the shots were not producing the expected effect. And the vibroblade was more interesting, the humming molecular edge capable of cutting materials that energy weapons only scorched, and Karn's used it with the skill of someone who had trained with it seriously. He scored the T-800's left forearm twice in the first exchange, the blade finding gaps in the living tissue exterior and leaving marks in the hyperalloy beneath that were the first genuinely damaging hits the T-800 had taken since their arrival. The T-800 adjusted. It always adjusted. It cataloged the blade's capabilities in the first two exchanges and modified its approach geometry to reduce the exposure window. And by the third exchange, it had Karn's wrist in a grip that ended the vibroblade's relevance to the engagement. It was careful. John had asked it to be careful, not to kill, not to damage beyond what the trial required, was to end the engagement at the point of clear decision rather than terminal conclusion. The T-800 understood the distinction because John had explained it and because the T-800 had been operating in this environment long enough to understand that outcomes here were political as well as physical. Karn's went to one knee with his wrist locked and his laser pistol gone, and the T-800's other hand positioned at his collar with the specific pressure that communicated, clearly and without ambiguity, that the next escalation was the last one available to him. He stayed there for 3 seconds. "Selah," said the voice on the command channel, the superior formally acknowledging the outcome. "It is done." The binding word. The trial's conclusion, spoken by appropriate authority, carrying the full weight of clan honor behind it. Karn's looked up at the T-800 from one knee, with the expression of a man reassembling himself around a new understanding of the world. The anger still present, but transformed. No longer the hot anger of wounded pride, but something cooler and more considered. The anger of someone beginning to think rather than react. "What are you?" he said, not to John, to the T-800. "A machine directed by a human," the T-800 said, "operating within the terms of your trial system because the human directing me chose to engage your honor protocols rather than circumvent them." Karn's absorbed this. "Why?" "Because circumventing them would have won this engagement," John said from the perimeter, his voice carrying across the combat ground in the morning quiet. "Engaging them honestly was harder. It was also the only approach that produced an outcome your Khan could accept as binding." A long silence. The smoke from the Timberwolf's wreckage had thinned to a gray thread against the brightening sky. "The cataloging data," Karn said. He'd worked it out. John could see him working it out. The ground operation, the missing data core, the shape of what had actually happened over the last 12 hours. "You took the assessment." "Your Khan gets incomplete data," John said. "The logistics case for a full cluster deployment to this system doesn't hold without it. You have time to make a different recommendation." "You are asking me to recommend against the conquest of this system." "I'm asking you to tell your Khan the truth about what the data actually shows," John said, "which is that it's incomplete. What your Khan does with that is between your Khan and your honor system." Another silence. The elemental escort had not moved. The Iron Pack's Mechwarriors had not moved. The combat ground held its breath in the particular way that moments did when something was being decided that would propagate forward in ways nobody present could fully calculate. Karn stood. He retrieved his vibroblade from where the T-800 had placed it, carefully, deliberately, at a neutral distance, and holstered it with the precise movements of a warrior re-establishing his composure around a new set of facts. "You fight strangely," he said. "Both of you." "We fight with what we have," John said. "Against whatever we're facing. That's all anyone does." Carnes looked at him for a long moment. The teenager from nowhere, with the machine that had put a clan star colonel on one knee, the mercenary company that had survived a clan raid through tactical creativity rather than hardware parity. And then he turned and walked back toward his lines with the deliberate pace of a man who had more thinking to do than the immediate situation required. The trial was over. The Iron Pact had survived. In the debriefing that followed, Valdis running it with the thoroughness of a commander who understood that surviving was only useful if you learned from it. John sat beside the T-800 and thought about Avantha's datapad notation, about what she'd written when she released him back into the field. He thought about a culture that had built Skynet's selection logic into its social structure and called it honor, and about a machine built to end humanity that had just defended it in a trial system designed by humans who were trying to be better than the ones they'd left behind. None of it was simple. None of it was clean. The T-800 looked at him with its flat amber gaze. "The temporal displacement device," it said. "Peter believes he has identified components in the Iron Pact's technical inventory that are analogous to the damaged capacitor array." John looked at it. "How long?" 2 weeks, possibly less. 2 weeks. Enough time to help the Iron Pact consolidate their position, to ensure Carnes's incomplete report reached his con without further complications, to do whatever small things could be done for 40,000 civilians on 3 worlds that a clan force had just decided were interesting. "Tell Peter to start," John said. "See, but don't rush it." The T-800 processed this. "You want to remain." "I want to make sure we've actually fixed what we came to fix," John said. "Leaving before the situation is stable isn't fixing it. It's just leaving." Outside the hangar, Wotan's landing was beginning the particular work of a settlement that had survived something it wasn't supposed to survive. Clearing debris, assessing damage, finding out who hadn't made it, and beginning the process of carrying that forward. The Iron Pact's Mechwarriors were running post-engagement maintenance cycles, the sound of technical work replacing the sound of weapons. Valdis found him as the debrief concluded, standing at the hangar entrance watching the work. "Carnes' dropship broke orbit 40 minutes ago," she said. "Told me his trinary is withdrawing." "Good. The clan command channel has been active. I don't have the translation capacity to follow all of it." She paused. "But the tone has changed." John nodded. Tone was data. Tone was sometimes the most important data. "We have 2 weeks," he said. "Let's use them." Valdis stood beside him for a moment, looking out at the work in the morning and the smoke still rising from the combat ground, where a clan star colonel had gone to one knee in front of a machine and gotten up with a different understanding of the universe. "Indeed," she said, and almost smiled. Somewhere in the Iron Pact's technical stores, Peter was already pulling components, his hands moving through inventory with the focused energy of a man who had been given a problem worth solving. In the hangar behind them, Ed Okafor's team was running diagnostics on the Hunchback, cataloging what 48 hours of unprecedented operation had taught them about the limits and possibilities of their own hardware. On the command channel, Clan Wolf's logistics assessment sat incomplete in a database that now had a gap where 3 worlds' worth of supply data used to be. And somewhere a con was reading a report that said more information required where it was supposed to say ready for conquest. Small things. Insufficient things, maybe, measured against the scale of a clan invasion that had hundreds of worlds still ahead of it and decades still to run. But John Connor had learned, in basements, in ruins, across a war that machines had calculated humanity couldn't win, that the scale of a problem was never the right measure of whether to fight it. Was you fought it because it was in front of you. You fought it with what you had. You built the victory that was possible, and you made it count, and then you found the next fight. The gate home was 2 weeks away. There was work to do before then. The Iron Pact filed its after-action report with the Mercenary Review Board 3 weeks later, a document that would circulate quietly through certain military analyst circles for years afterward. Notable not for its account of the Clan Wolf raid, which was one of hundreds occurring across the frontier that season, but for the technical appendices Okafor attached regarding interface innovations developed during the engagement period. The report listed 2 attached personnel, designated Connor, J, and Unit T-800, under the category Independent Contractors, Temporary Assignment. Their contributions were noted as significant. Their origins were listed as undetermined. Karn's report to his Khan recommended delayed action pending complete logistical assessment of the Wotan system. The full cluster deployment was postponed. 3 worlds bought time they didn't know they'd been given by people they'd never know existed. The temporal displacement device worked on the 14th day. John stood in the emission field with the T-800 beside him and looked at Valdis and Peter and Okafor and the assembled Iron Pact, who had gathered without being asked, which told him something about what the 2 weeks had built between them. Another time, Valdis said, which was, under the circumstances, the most accurate farewell available. The flash was white, then nothing. And then the terrible familiar work of finding out where and when they'd landed this time. The mission continued.